Amateur Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Hello, Nina. Hello, everybody. How are you doing?
Hi, Marcelo. I'm well. Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina show where we discuss difficult topics. And today we have quite a broad one. We're going to talk about the transformation of Russian ideology and its practical applications. We'll see where the conversation takes us. And I'm very excited to have our guest today, whose work I've been following on X/Twitter for quite some time. I especially appreciate his, I'm not sure if he's still doing those, but used to be 2-minute clips where he'd summarize a really difficult topic, really complex topic in a way that's really accessible and really make those who are not necessarily familiar with particular geopolitical subjects understand them a lot better. And the guest is George Szamuely. I probably mispronounced that. He is a PhD, so perhaps we should be calling him doctor. He is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute based out of London. He himself is in Hungary. He is the author of a topic that we talk about a lot on this channel. It's a book that was published about 10 years ago called Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. So please be sure to check it out because I know you guys are interested in this topic. You keep requesting it. He is a prolific writer, having contributed to numerous publications, including The Telegraph, The Spectator, The American Spectator, The American Conservative, and many, many others. He's also doing a pretty regular podcast/live stream called The Gaggle. You can check it out in his X/Twitter, and everything is linked in the description. So Marcelo, let's bring George, or Dr. George, on.
All right. Welcome, Dr. George. No, not welcome yet because I forgot to put you both guys on the screen. No problem. Here we are. Hello, Dr. George. I'm sorry for the problematic entrance.
No problem at all. Welcome, Marcello. Welcome, Nina. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Finally, it's really good to have you here. And first, I always ask every guest, is there anything that I mispronounced or screwed up about your description? And is there anything that you'd like the viewers to know before we jump into the topic?
That you got my pronunciation more or less right, but it's actually Szamuely.
Szamuely. Dr. Szamuely. Would you rather us be calling you Dr. Szamuely or George?
George is fine.
George is fine. Less formal. Okay, so is there anything that you're working on these days that I haven't mentioned that you'd like our listeners and viewers to be aware of?
Well, I'm writing a sequel to Bombs for Peace that is more focused on the international criminal tribunals, in particular the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia that was set up by the UN Security Council in 1993, but was very quickly taken over by the NATO powers. And the task was to ensure in the public consciousness and for all time in history that the Serbs alone were guilty for the destruction of Yugoslavia. The Serbs alone were guilty for the wars that followed the destruction of Yugoslavia. And the Serbs alone were guilty for all of the atrocities, the genocide, the crimes, everything. And that was the task of the ICTY. And of course, it's been pretty much accepted by most people that, well, this is a serious judicial body, was set up by the United Nations, and therefore we need to take seriously and accept the findings of the criminal cases. And most of the criminal cases, pretty much all of the criminal cases found the Serbs guilty, and they were meted out brutally harsh punishments. So basically, that's the project I'm working on.
Yeah, we didn't discuss this in detail, but we literally talked about the way this court transformed in a previous episode. So you guys can go and look back at that episode. Do you have any particular ETA for when the book might be out? I know sounds like it's using a lot of archival information.
I hope it'll be sometime relatively soon. And I'm not sure exactly when the ETA. I have to admit, I'm a bit of a slow worker, a bit of a procrastinator. So if I say it'll be this date, then it's bound to be wrong. So I hope that it'll be sometime in the next year.
Wow. Well, that's definitely something to look forward to. What type of archival information are you using to pull all this together? Because it sounds like it's, a lot of different countries, legal information, media coverage, obviously being pulled into the same narrative.
Well, I'm using obviously the transcripts of the tribunal. They are still available. What isn't really available anymore is the archive of the ICTY. The archive was actually quite useful because they had all the the witness statements, the depositions, the evidence that was submitted to the courts, the various experts' reports, and everything else. And it was a really useful source of information, but that's gone. It's just simply not available anymore. The only thing that is available, at least for the time being, is are the transcripts. Who knows how long they're going to be available. So you can have the transcripts. Interesting. There was also a project that was, I think, Bard University or Bard College in the United States, where they actually had the video depository of the trials, and they were really fascinating because a transcript by itself doesn't necessarily reveal all that much, but when you watch the videos, I think they're much more telling. And in particular, we followed, I think, the most interesting trial of all of them, which was the trial of Slobodan Milosevic. The video was always interesting. I mean, it's like Milosevic's, I think, brilliant questioning, his kind of sarcasm. He was running rings around these stupid judges. And the sort of irritation and nastiness of the judges, it doesn't quite come across in the transcript. You get a lot out of them, but the video was always very telling. The videos are more or less gone. I mean, you can get little clips on YouTube, but that was really useful to have that big video library, and that's all.
What is the official reasoning behind having this information no longer available?
I'm not on any official explanation. I mean, I've written, asking, and they just say it's not available, and then that's
wow, that's really fascinating. So, what is your opinion about this criminal court that still exists today? I mean, we're obviously thinking of something like this court charging Putin and one of his officials with what was the official statement? Kidnapping children from a war zone, which was essentially a rescue operation to evacuate civilians, and it was just turned upside down and presented in a very different way. So we know how, this court was set up and how it's being used today. What do you think about it these days?
Well, that's very interesting because the ICC uses as its jurisprudence the findings of the ICTY, and then the Rwanda Tribunal, which is kind of similar. It was a sister court of the Yugoslav Tribunal. I mean, it had the same prosecutor, Carla Del Ponte, and then before her there was Louise Arbour. So they were the chief prosecutor of one tribunal, was also the chief prosecutor of the other. So yes, they're using those findings as this jurisprudence. Now, the ICC actually, in some ways, has less basis, less legal foundation than the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals, because the ICC wasn't even set up by the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council, at a time when Russia was very weak and feeble, this was 1993. This was the spring of 1993. I think it's Andrei Kozyrev, I think, was the Russian foreign minister. So they raised no objection to the establishment of this tribunal, even though it was obvious, should have been obvious to the Russians, should have been obvious that the whole purpose of this tribunal will be to target the Serbs, that the Serbs were the guilty party. So they set this up, but at least it under chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, that this was some great threat to international security, and therefore the UN Security Council has the authority to do what it can in order to maintain international peace. But the ICC was never set up by the UN Security Council, so it doesn't even have the imprimatur of the United Nations. It's just countries voluntarily signing on to the Rome Statute, and what happened then? Of course, the United States signed on to the Rome Statute under Bill Clinton, but of course, no one ever believed for one moment the United States would ratify the Rome Statute. Of course, it didn't ratify it even under Bill Clinton, and then I think 2 years later, I think 2002 or 2003, George W. Bush completely withdrew. I mean, in other words, he just withdrew the signature. And then also they passed I think it's called the Hague Rescue Act, so that if anyone at any time is arrested on the orders of the ICC, any American is arrested on the orders of the ICC and detained, then the United States can send its forces in and rescue this American. So that's why it was called the Hague Invasion Act. So if he's locked up in the Hague, then the Americans could send in the Marines and rescue him. That was passed again very early in the 2000s. Now, what the ICC does is, of course, target the powers that the Western chief states want targeted. And so, most of the victims of the ICC had been the African countries who foolishly signed on to this, thinking that, oh, this is great, this is international law is being taken seriously, but they signed on to this. And they were clearly targeted because it's easy to target them. And then of course, they did this to Libya at the time of the NATO, when NATO bombed Libya in order to get rid of Gaddafi. And then, within a few weeks of the beginning of the bombing, the ICC came out with an indictment of Muammar Gaddafi, and I think, as well as his son, and I think the chief of intelligence in Libya. And of course, this helped, the propaganda that, whoa, we must be doing something right. The ICC has indicted these, because ICC hadn't done any kind of investigation or anything of Gaddafi. Was in no position to know Gaddafi has committed any kinds of war crimes, which again, this was very much along the lines of the ICTY, where they would indict Milosevic in the middle of NATO's bombing campaign in 1999. They hadn't done any investigation. There's no way that they could have possibly known whether Milosevic had committed any war crimes, but it was a wonderful propaganda boost. Now, just going back to your question, that was also very useful against Putin, because there they were. They came along and said, oh, Putin has committed war crimes, and this is the abduction. And Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, he said, "Oh, arrest warrant," and the court, interestingly enough, immediately signed off on the arrest warrant. Again, no serious investigation had taken place, but it served. Oh wow, look at that. This is the sort of person that Putin is. This is the sort of person that we're up against. But of course, one of the key features of the ICC was, well, if you don't sign on, if you don't sign the Rome Statute, then the ICC has no jurisdiction over you unless you're in a war against someone who has signed on. Now, the problem with the Ukraine war was that Ukraine also hadn't signed on to the ICC, so they had to get around this problem, And so what happened is that Ukraine said, well, we don't really accept the jurisdiction of the ICC, except for any wars on our territory after 2015. So that just on that limited scope, they say, yeah, we on anything on our territory after 2015, then we do accept the ICC jurisdiction, and that's how the ICC could get around it and then issue its arrest warrant against Putin. And again, so again, the Americans were very happy. Well, this is great, even though, of course, the United States had never accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. But then, if you recall, Karim Khan also said that he would. He was thinking of issuing an indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think the Gallant, I think the defense minister, and Sinwar, the Hamas leader. So he was going to submit it to the court, so that the court can sign off on this arrest warrant. Well, that was several months ago, and I mean, he submitted it, but there's been no determination by the ICC, so there's no arrest warrant issued against Netanyahu and Gallant and so on. So you can see the difference with Putin. It happened automatically. Boom, boom. Here's the arrest warrant issued against Putin, and then but in the case of Netanyahu, Karim Khan says, yeah, I'm definitely going to put this forward for the court, and the court's as yet to issue the arrest warrant.
The one attempt to actually try to use this court semi-legitimately, would you say that international courts like these is their primary purpose then instrumental in terms of propaganda? I mean, I guess excluding the actual punishments of Serbs and the African leaders.
I think it is, because we know that the United States, the NATO powers, they simply will not accept any submission, to the dictates of international courts. It's never going to happen. So you have the Human Rights Brigade that maintains this fraud, this absolute fraud, whereby they support these international courts, and then when you point out to them, well, what kind of a court is this, when the people the countries that have muscle simply refuse to accept their jurisdiction? How this isn't a court. You either have equal justice or you have no justice. Oh, well, no. We look forward to the day when the United States will accept. This is just simply the first step. Eventually the United States will accept. And so they then, on this absolutely nonsensical basis of believing that the United States will one day accept the jurisdiction of any of these international courts, on the basis of this, they go around celebrating and rejoicing every time one of these international courts issues an indictment. This is a historic breakthrough. This is a major one. And a head of state has now been indicted by the International Criminal Court. This is fantastic. And they did this, throughout the 90s. Wow. The ICTY has indicted Slobodan Milosevic. This is a glorious breakthrough for the end of impunity, a glorious breakthrough in holding political leaders accountable. It's no breakthrough at all. It just means that great powers can control the instruments of coercion, which are in these international courts, and use them against those that they want to crush militarily. So but that's why that Human Rights Brigade sort of introduced so much into intellectual pollution in the discussion about international law.
Yeah, I guess the obvious question would be, we still haven't gotten to the question of Russia specifically, but the obvious question would be, what is the value of international law then? It seems like it works as long as everyone cooperates, and getting everyone to cooperate is obviously, a very difficult question.
Well, it is a difficult question. I mean, the problem is, of course, that, we sort of know roughly what in international law is, but ultimately, if there's no prospect of it ever being applied, no prospect that anyone's actually going to accept it, then it just becomes a matter of propaganda. So you get the United States, that declares suddenly it believes in international law when it condemns somebody else's aggression. Um, when it's American aggression or NATO aggression, they suddenly start talking about other things, which so the concepts that they just invent themselves, like the responsibility to protect. So they say, oh, the responsibility to protect. So somehow we have a right, we elevated, morally righteous great powers, we have a right to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries because we have a responsibility to protect the victims, those who have been victimized. We're coming in as these avenging angels to rescue them from the depredations, whether it's of the Russians or the Serbs. So they just invent new notions when the international law doesn't really, the argument about international law doesn't work in their favor. So it's like, well, what about the invasion of Iraq? Well, then they say, yeah, but we had to act preemptively because we had the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And anyway, it was all because of these terrible people who just didn't go along with us at the United Nations Security Council. We tried to do it, go through the UN Security Council, but they wouldn't do it. So it's somebody else's fault that international law, we didn't get the permission slip that you tell us that we should have got a permission slip before we invaded this country. And that's exactly the argument that they used about, well, you bombed Yugoslavia without any UN Security Council authorization. Isn't that a violation of international law? Yeah, but it's because the Russians just wouldn't sign off on it. I mean, what could we do? But of course, the whole point of this is that it's the way it works is that it's authorized when the UN Security Council is ready to authorize, and sign off on it. If the UN Security Council doesn't authorize it, then that's it. You can't do it. I mean, it's the same as if, let's say, the police, simply shoot up and kill, I don't know, 10 people, and then they say, well, where's your authority to kill all these people? Well, what can we do? I mean, the courts would just have let them go. I mean, we just had to take the matters into our own hands because we couldn't do it with the courts. So that's really the problem, that international law, talking about it works only when it favors your side. When it doesn't favor, then you start bringing up all sorts of things. And I think it's an unfortunate thing that Russia often tries to win an argument by saying, well, we take international law seriously, but the United States and the West doesn't. They don't believe in, they keep talking about something called the rules-based order. Who the hell knows what the rules-based order is? What are the rules and where's the order? And while that's correct, the Russian position is correct, the point is that nobody cares. Of course, international doesn't mean anything. Of course, the Americans don't believe in it and just simply spout it when it's convenient for them. But the point is that there's no point in even invoking it and thinking that somehow we're winning the argument because we're bringing up international law. It's just a complete waste of time.
Yeah, may I just jump in here just a second? It's very. I always joke about this thing of Hague and ICC, ICJ, whatever. That what are you gonna do? You're gonna send a lawyer to summon the Putin with three-color paper, blue, pink, with the stamps, and he's going to say, "Oh, damn, I got these three-color papers. Now I have to be arrested." And international law really doesn't make any sense to me once a country can just say, no, come in. You're going to make me, that's kind of Russia. You're going to make me do that?
Yeah.
No. United States, you're going to make me do that? No. So what's the point of having that? And it's extremely important what you say. Now I'm going to talk a little bit just quickly to the Brazilian public that not too long ago, and not defending any president because I think they all crap in Brazil, but the last president that we had, Bolsonaro, during the well, I cannot say that term. You know, the thing that people needed to get injections. He was accused of another word that I cannot use. You know, blipnocide, because of not buying stuff, and the other party filed a complaint in the ICC, like, oh, he's committing blipnocide. And then what?
Right.
That's what I asked myself. Then what? What are you going to do? You're going to send an army to arrest the president of Brazil? What? But it works perfectly for the propaganda of the opposition that say, hey, see, we filed a complaint that he is a blipnocide. So he is a blipnocide because it's filed. It's a bureaucratic mind. I'm about to record a video about bureaucratic mind and the recent change on the nuclear doctrine of the Russia, which for me was fantastic. But
I agree entirely, and that's why I remember when last year South Africa filed the genocide lawsuit against Israel, and I went on to a number of shows, and everybody was so excited. This is fantastic. You know, what do you think of this? Isn't this amazing? This is such a great day. South Africa's now done this. They filed this genocide suit against Israel, and you know, I have to say that, you know, I don't think anyone liked me for saying it. It's not going to make it one bit of difference. Do you think Israel cares? I mean, you know, first of all, they're going to call South Africa anti-Semitic. They're going to call all the judges on the ICJ who vote against Israel anti-Semitic. When finally the ICJ will make its genocide ruling, which will probably not be for another 15 years, and everyone's already going to be forgotten about it, Israel would just simply say, we don't care because you're all a bunch of anti-Semites anyway. So what's the point of getting excited about this? Oh, but it'll be on the record. So what? I mean, the ICJ has made any number of rulings already about the illegality of Israeli occupation. And we don't even need the ICJ. We know it's illegal. I mean, we know the lands that Israel has occupied since 1967 are illegal. I mean, we don't, you know, and so, but they made 2004. The ICJ ruled that the wall that Israel has built around the West Bank was illegal. Who cares? And then we had another determination, you know, a few weeks ago again about the Israeli occupation is illegal. It doesn't matter because Israel will never accept any of these rulings, and the ICJ has no enforcement mechanism. The ICC also has no enforcement mechanism unless somebody decides to take it upon himself, and that can only be done by the United States and NATO, to arrest someone. They can go in and seize someone, you know, preferably some small country that can't fight back. And yeah, the Americans could, in theory, you know, send in their forces and seize a political leader, haul him off to The Hague. I mean, they're not going to do it because that would lend legitimacy to the ICC, and the United States doesn't really want to do that. But otherwise, these things mean absolutely nothing. People get very excited about them, some, very decent people, but they don't amount to anything because, in the end, it's power that really matters.
Yeah, it seems like power definitely overrides this legalistic mentality, for better or for worse. But let's shift gears a little bit. We're talking about Putin, and I was going over some, I guess now they're older articles. This one is from 2004, so it's been 20 years. It was published in a major academic journal called Kritika, which means critique, which publishes things in English. And it was published by an academic whose name was Olga Malinova. And she wrote about the topic of liberal nationalism from the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And she basically compared and contrasted what she considered to be two main movements, which she called right-wing anti-Semitic nationalism, and the other she called liberal nationalism. And then she made a parallel to today's Russia. So for her, this was 2004, so the early days of Putin. And she said the same model exists in Russia 20 years ago. So I'm curious, what do you think about this analysis to begin with? And also, how did it survive, or did it survive? Did it last until today?
Well,
or is this a completely wrong way of even looking at Russia? I mean, I definitely have strong opinions about it, but
to me, this is a wrong way of viewing Russia. I mean, I do think that there is something called this the Russian nation, the essentially the Russian civilization, the Russian world. It's not quite this terminology of the liberal nationalism, which is somehow a nation state, and then it's called civic nationalism. I mean, there's something called Russianness that I think Putin has tried to inculcate. We can discuss whether it's when he's done it successfully or not, but it's very interesting that the people present this in this kind of formulation of anti-Semitic. They always bring in this sort of somehow this anti-Semitism. Now, I don't really think there's anything to that. It's because one of the reasons why they bring up the sort of anti-Semitism is, I think, and this goes back to the Bolshevik Revolution, because the Bolsheviks, there was a high preponderance of Jews among them, and but they didn't think of themselves as Jews, but they were high preponderance, and they were obviously very hostile to Russianness, Russian nationalism. I mean, absolutely, the way Lenin talked about it, they talked with utter contempt about Russia, and this state that they created, the Soviet Union, was founded on hostility and opposition to the Russian nation, to the Russian people. This is, it was in opposition to greater Russian chauvinism. And the Bolsheviks really carried out this policy, this korenizatsiya, this indigenization, in which every nationality was to be elevated, was to be championed, was to be recognized. They were just inventing these nations out of whole cloth, with the exception of the Russian nation. The Russian people were the only ones who were not to be accepted. But the curious thing is that by doing this, and however much the West may have been anti-communist, this was quite happy for the West. The West was quite happy to see essentially Russia to be downgraded and demeaned and found to be in some ways lesser than all these nationalisms that the Bolsheviks intended. And I think this continued throughout the history of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think there were changes made under Stalin, and I think that which was, I think, is in response, I mean, among other things, there are other reasons, but in response to what happened in World War II, whereby essentially it was the Russian nation and only the Russian nation that really didn't collaborate at all with the Nazis. And I think Stalin was a little surprised by this, because everyone else collaborated, and the Bolsheviks had treated the Russians so badly, they were expecting the Russians to collaborate with the Nazi occupiers, but they didn't, with the sole exception of Vlasov. And I think as a result of that, I think Stalin did make considerable concessions to Russianness, with the opening of churches, and which were kept open after the war. So in a way, when the West suddenly was confronted, as the Soviet Union collapsed, with hey, now we're going to have Russia, they immediately invented this idea that somehow this Russia that will emerge from the Soviet Union will be anti-Semitic. It's going to go against the Bolsheviks, and that this is something that's really bad. And this became a real obsession. I mean, you probably remember in the late 80s or 90s, this was just an absolute obsession in the New York Times and everywhere else about the growing anti-Semitism, the huge anti-Semitism in Russia. They could never come up with any serious evidence of anti-Semitism. In fact, it's rather the reverse. I think Putin is very philo-Semitic. But I think that somehow it's an interesting aspect of it, that what the Bolsheviks did to Russia, and as well as in fueling every single non-Russian nationalism around, is something that the West wanted. The West thought, yeah, great, yeah, this is good. And again, there's a parallel there a little bit with Yugoslavia, whereas again, the Serbs, who were really obviously the biggest nation and were the founding nation of Yugoslavia, they were downgraded by Tito and the communists, and they kind of elevated every other non-Serb nationality. And of course, then when Yugoslavia began this disintegration, the West was very eager to fuel the very disintegration that had actually been fostered by the communists.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that there are two sides to this indigenization or korenizatsiya, right, that began in the 1920s. One was ideological. So the Bolsheviks, Lenin specifically, thought about it as sort of using decolonization, which was a term we use today, but within the borders of the Soviet Union, which sounds really strange, you know, to modern people, because if you think about the decolonization of Africa, obviously, for example, right, that's very different. And yes, he talked about great Russian chauvinism from that perspective, from the perspective of decolonization and, you know, obviously moving away from capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the practical component, right, that the Bolsheviks, who were, you know, even though they won the civil war, they're weak. They were establishing this new huge country. They're sort of reconnecting some of the old parts of the Russian Empire that was splintered, and they needed, you know, their own people in the regions. And that was one way to create their own support in the regions, is by boosting these nationalities, as we call them in Russian, I guess, ethnicities or ethnocultural groups, as you can call them in English. And in some cases, these ethnicities did exist. They did have their own culture. In other cases, some of them were just basically invented almost out of nowhere. And I'm sure you know, again, it's a book that's now more than 20 years old, Terry Martin's Affirmative Action Empire. It's a pretty good study in terms of, yes, it's written by a Western historian, but it's a pretty good study in showing how, by creating what essentially is these many, many nation states within the borders of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, that were, of course, were not thinking about what's going to happen 100 years from now, essentially set this ticking time BOMG. And when things got tough, it was very easy for the Soviet Union to dissolve from that perspective, because these states were essentially ready in every way except maybe economically, because the Soviet Union was so integrated in that regard. But in terms of culture, literature, alphabets that maybe didn't even exist, they were ready. So there was really no foresight on the Bolsheviks' part in this regard. And I think the Stalin question is really interesting too, because he, time and time again, I mean, obviously he was a very brutal ruler, but he was also very practical too. So, you know, he obviously went back on a lot of these Bolshevik policies of the 1920s with the so-called Stalin Constitution of the 30s. And yes, the pivotal moment in 1945 was when he raised his toast to the great Russian people, right? So he's sort of like a Georgian who was a Russophile, but I think he sort of was that way because the history basically pushed him in this direction, and he recognized the necessity to change that particular policy. But yes, they didn't completely move away from it. It was much maybe more fair than before, explicitly, you know, trying to crush what Lenin described as great Russian chauvinism. But yes, it was still very much in existence. Yeah, I think it's important for our viewers to understand that it was sort of a two-pronged approach. The ideological is part of it, but also the practical part of it, which eventually was maybe less important when the Soviet Union was sort of solidified through the meat grinder of World War II, in terms of having this very, you know, insane, shared historic life or death experience, but it definitely was still in place. So I'd like to then think about how that
reiterate. I mean, Stalin's approach was a little different from Lenin's approach, even from an early stage, because when they created the Soviet Union, I think Lenin kind of wanted to and his view prevailed, was to create all these independent republics. So there was what was the Russian Empire. Now they suddenly had all these independent republics, and it became the Union of Soviet Socialist republics. Stalin, wanted them essentially republics within Russia. That they were part of Russia. That would have been, I think, I mean, obviously it's a kind of, coulda, woulda, shoulda, who knows? Could well have been a more successful model than what Lenin created. Lenin, obviously he had much greater authority than Stalin. And, even though Stalin was really their supposed expert on nationalities, but the creation of all these republics was always going to be a headache. I mean, obviously, and particularly the way it was done, which was to establish these so-called titular nations. So once you had the titular nations within each of them, so if you create like the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic, then you have the titular nation, which was the Ukrainians, or Georgia. You have the titular nation. Well, they were obviously going to advantage themselves over everyone else. They were obviously going to, put their own people in places of power, and they were obviously going to downgrade, humiliate others, and particularly the Russians. And so, in a way, the seeds of the destruction of the USSR was laid by Lenin. And I think that by doing it that way, it was never going to succeed. So Stalin had a different model, and I think even before World War II. I mean, I said the World War II, I think, sealed it in his mind about when they said the Russians, a toast to the Russian people, the greatest nation of the USSR. So I think even in the 1930s, he was beginning to realize that somehow we are losing control, because in every republic, they're kind of going in their own way. I mean, you've got these essentially Ukrainian nationalists, who are coming to the fore, and the Russians, and really ultimately the Bolsheviks. Most of the Bolsheviks were Russians. I mean, that was the problem. I mean, that was so the Russians were getting more and more demoted in the Soviet Union, and we're even, I think, in the 1930s, Stalin was beginning to see that this is a real problem is beginning to emerge here.
So how would you then go and look at modern Russia? Obviously, it's a multi-ethnic state. I think officially, and of course, Russia is drawing from the Soviet experience. There are more than, like 190 ethnicities, some of which are actual ethnicities with long histories. Others perhaps were really boosted during the Soviet period. How would you think about modern Russia today? I don't think the term nationalism personally is a good term, because not only are we thinking of these ethnic nationalisms in the republics, but we're also thinking of Russian nationalism. Usually it's also quite destructive, because it's only focused on the Russian ethnicity. And then, of course, in the 90s and the 2000s, you had, for example, all these calls of stop feeding the Caucasus, stop giving them money, which essentially the logical conclusion of that would be separating the entire Caucasus from Russia. So in my mind, the term nationalism for a multi-ethnic state is very destructive. It doesn't matter whom it's coming from. And we also have all these other terms being floated around, like Eurasianism, which is more multi-ethnic. Obviously, maybe liberal patriotism would be another term. What is your perception of modern Russia in the ideological sense?
Well, I think that it has to be something along the lines of a kind of a Russian civilization, that, whatever your ethnic background, whatever your religious affiliation, you subscribe to something called Ruski Mir, and that this, you get this, is your entry into it. It's very difficult to do. I mean, I really think, it's such a huge, diverse country. But so it has to be obviously Russian literature, Russian culture, Russian history, and I think that it has to be the Russian historical experience as somehow uniting these very diverse people. I'd have to say that given the diversity, I think Russia is more successful than other countries trying to unite their peoples together. I mean, when you think of, say, the United Kingdom, which is a much more homogeneous place than Russia, I mean, it is failing to do so. I mean, it's actually failing to maintain that United Kingdom, something that was inconceivable, I don't know, 50 years ago, that so little binds the people of the United Kingdom together. So Russia is having at least some success in defining the side of Ruski Mir. But of course, the other thing that Putin has introduced and has obviously played up is, I think, the World War II experience. So that idea that we face this crucible of total destruction, we faced death. We were face to face with death at that moment in 1941. We prevailed. We had our greatest triumph, and that this should somehow keep us together, particularly as we're facing something similar today. I mean, that's an interesting concept. I'm not sure how long you can keep that going, but again, I think it's a part of Putin's kind of attempt to create some kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say it's an ideology, but some sort of a national ethos.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Putin has been criticized for today is that the post-Soviet Russian constitution does not have an ideological component, pardon me, and it's a constitution that's based on Western models. So a lot of the general public, again, this is, I mean, I've seen columnists talk about this, I've seen random people on social media, so this is anecdotal, but there's definitely an urge to have something more specific and concise, which you're exactly right. It's very difficult to do for a country like Russia, but arrive at some kind of an ideology that's actually codified, maybe not legally, but at least overtly in terms of state propaganda, in terms of sort of defining the direction in which Russia is heading more specifically. We certainly have terms like multipolarity thrown around, but that's more about foreign policy and where Russia is heading in this regard. It's not really so, I mean, it obviously relates to domestic politics, but it's not as focused on the internal Russia as it should be. So do you think it makes sense, or is it just impossible to come up with an ideology? Maybe going back to the ideas of the 19th century, the specific Russian ideas of social justice, which was, I really want to separate that from the way the term social justice is used in North America, because for a lot of people, especially conservatives, it has a negative connotation. So the very particular Russian idea of social justice, and then applying it to perhaps the diversity of Russian people who are not all ethnically Russian.
I think that's absolutely possible, and you're absolutely right that their idea of social justice was, I think, different from what we normally think of as a social justice, and it's very much not about the championing of minorities, which is the way the West now thinks of social justice. You're trying to break societies up and slice and dice countries, with all these different minorities, whether it's transgender or gay, women, black, brown, and whatever, Asian. And so that somehow is defined social justice when you elevate all these different elements of society. Russia, on the contrary, tries to find some uniting idea. But the problem is that it is difficult. I mean, you had the communism, and that did provide an ideology. It energized young people. It energized the intelligentsia. But of course, that could only last so long. I mean, it was ultimately when failures began to appear, then the communism as an ideology began to disappear. But on the other hand, I mean, it's ultimately the fault of the communists. I think a communist could have done a much better job, by maintaining some new version of communism. I mean, again, the Chinese have managed to adapt Maoism. They brought in new elements to it, but for some reason, the Russian communists were not able to do it because ultimately, the if one goes back to the Gorbachev era, yes, you can argue that Russia, communism, Soviet Union has fallen behind the United States. We're not, we're not as rich or successful as the capitalist West. But so what? You can still say, okay, well, history is a long process. Just because we haven't caught up, in 70 years, that doesn't mean we're not going to catch up in the next 50 years. We just have to, try harder, and so on. So there was never really a reason to toss everything away the way that Gorbachev did. You could have reimagined it, you could have adapted it, and so on. But as the Chinese did, but they basically just tossed it aside and embraced in a mindless way a kind of Western capitalism, of course, and there was a disaster for Russia. So I do think it is very difficult now to come up with some new unifying ideology, and I think that's why the one that they've been most successful with so far has been the memory of World War II. But I mean, hey, you probably know more about this than I do. I mean, the issue of Russian culture and Russian civilization, there may be more to it than that. I mean, there could be some way in which it could be put to use for a kind of that we have a distinctive Russian civilization. It's very different from that of the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is in the context of multipolarity. Putin and other Russian officials push for traditionalism, right? They talk about it in very general terms because traditionalism in one place is not the traditionalism of another country. But basically, they talk about sort of the typical social conservative values of, family values and respecting religion or religions of a particular place. And so there is that connection between domestic policy and foreign policy of trying to push toward multipolarity that's perceived as, something that would bring about a more, fairer world. And I guess it's possible to apply that to Russia, but again, you have the challenge of unifying people with different religions. Again, Western historians usually talk about Russian nationalism in the context of orthodoxy, but of course, in today's day and age, I don't really think that's applicable. Some would say that, Islam in the Caucasus is much more of a living religion than orthodoxy is in terms of measuring maybe church attendance and things like that. Although I would say cultural orthodoxy is still important without necessarily going to church on such and such days. But that's definitely one of the ways that I think it's being tackled, but I'm just not sure whether it's a tackling that's successful. I think there's some promise in thinking of these traditional social structures in a technologically modern context. So it's like the fact that a society is technologically advanced does not mean that we now have to destroy all other norms that we subscribe to for thousands of years. I mean, that's what China has generally been doing. It's a obviously very technologically advanced society, in some ways more advanced than the West. But at the same time, those so-called traditional social norms are generally maintained. What do you think about that?
Well, I know I agree entirely. I think the question then is, Russia faces a serious existential problem. I mean, it obviously has the problem of a threat from the West on its western flank, but the threat from the West is coming from everywhere. So it can't afford to lose any territory at all. So then you have to go back and think about, well, what would, if given the circumstances, what would, the Bolsheviks at their most ruthless, what would they have done? And in a similar, what would the Americans do in those circumstances? And then you say, well, they would have acted very, very ruthlessly. They would not have allowed, um, parts of their zones of influence simply to disappear on them. They essentially look at Armenia. They simply would not allow, Armenia, which is after all, basically it owes its survival. It owes its existence in the world to Russia. I mean, no, there's no one else. No one else in the world is going to come in and save them, other than Russia. So when you look at Armenia now, making nice with the West, with hanging out, this Pashinyan who hangs out with Macron and Schultz and so on. You think, well, this shouldn't be happening. This is something that the Russians would have to just insert themselves and make sure that Armenia stays on board. So you'd have to think in terms of somehow creating a cadre of people with some Russianist ideology. You can't have communist ideology, but some kind of an ideology that would make sure that there aren't any Pashinyans around to separate themselves, because otherwise this is just going to continue. There's going to be more of these Pashinyan figures who are just going to essentially say, "Hey, well, the food is better over there, so we'll just make nice with the West." That's exactly what the West is doing, and that's why, at this stage, you think, well, that's Armenia. Well, what's going to be next? Well, next is obviously Kazakhstan. Then it was good Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. I mean, all of these are being targeted by the West. But that it goes beyond that. These are the former republics of the USSR, but it also is within Russia proper. Obviously the Caucasus, with Chechens and others, Tatars. The West is going to move in on all of them. I mean, there's just this. That is something that we can't even argue about. The West is going to move in, so therefore Russia has to be in some ways preemptive. In the way that the Bolsheviks were. The Bolsheviks will face exactly the same problems. Hey, we are surrounded by the capitalist powers. They're going to pick us off, one at a time, one by one. They're going to pick us off. So we have to be preemptive and make sure that the West doesn't do so. We're going to create our own autonomous little republics here, and then see what the West does. I mean, the way Stalin did in Iran after World War II. Well, we're going to create an Azeri People's Republic. We're going to create a Kurdish People's Republic. In other words, it's always essentially the Bolsheviks at their best were preemptive. They're always thinking ahead and always one step ahead of what the West was doing. What's happening now, unfortunately, is that Russia is one or two steps behind the West. It's the West who's taking action, and then Russia is somehow trying to catch up. And I think that's not really feasible. And that's what that's what Russia now needs to be doing, thinking in terms of creating a cadre of people who are ready to move forward and preempt the inevitable attack from the West.
Yeah, the Armenians, I think you're exactly right. The Armenia situation always perplexed me because there's such a huge diaspora of Armenians in Russia. So it's sort of like a ready-made, cadres that you're talking about that could be used in this regard. I mean, I don't know exactly the relationship size-wise between the Russian Armenian diaspora versus the ones in the U.S., but it's probably just as sizable or maybe second largest. So that definitely surprised me because this seems to be like an easy step to take. I think Central Asia is a little bit different because of the Chinese influence. And so Russia is sort of playing this balancing act between, having this really deep strategic partnership with China. And of course, that means that China can come in into former Soviet spheres of influence. I mean, it can go to Belarus. And so I think Russia is really not challenging this in any regard, and I don't know if it needs to challenge this in any regard. Of course, China is obviously pursuing its own interests like any country would, first and foremost. But I think Central Asia in this sense is a little bit different because there's the West, the Western influence, there is Russia, and also China is exerting more and more influence these days. But do you think of any, I know it's really difficult, otherwise you'd be advising the Russian government, how can Russia preempt some of these things?
Well, you have to then, think of a much more energized, cadre, and you need to have been creating this for some time. I mean, this should have been done a long time ago. But again, all right, that's spilled milk. But it should be being prepared now that you want to have people in place. And Robert, look, some place like Kazakhstan. There's a big Russian population there. I mean, Kazakhstan was a key part of the Soviet Union. You can't just simply, sign it off to China. China's a very, maybe we disagree here. I don't think China is really much of a partner for Russia. I don't think China's done very much. Russia does most of the heavy lifting in the world. China's kind of doing its thing, but it's not really trying to change the balance of power in the world and the way Russia is doing. But if you look at Ukraine should have been fairly straightforward for Russia. It's hard to understand exactly, in the same way with Armenia, hard to exactly how we could have got to this position that a war became necessary. I mean, again, because of the closeness between the Russians and Ukrainians, and Putin, wrote that essay about that, and obviously there's a closeness between them. That should have been dealt with, pretty, at a very early stage, but somehow, Russia, I think, was reactive, was very slow, reacting at every stage in Ukraine. But that would have been an example precisely. You have a cadre of people who can immediately step in and run Ukraine with in partnership with Moscow. I mean, that absolutely should have been done. That's exactly what the Bolsheviks would have known how to do. Bolsheviks would have thought it's just common sense. Of course, this is how we're going to do it. And I think that I think is the failures of post Bolshevik Russia. And again, if one thinks of the Eastern Europe after World War II, I mean, they had their cadres in place everywhere, whom they could just move in, remove any leaders who were awkward, and install their favorite figure. So, I mean, in Hungary in 1956, for example, now, this is really kind of the masterful, again, something that the communists used to know how to do. They had a very awkward leader there who wasn't playing ball, was Imre Nagy. Then they brought in their own person, which was János Kádár. They removed Nagy, boom, you had the invasion, a lot of condemnation, a lot of world, oh my God, this is barbaric, the Soviets, there's this horrible, Time magazine made the Hungarian freedom fighter the man of the year. And the Soviets, they removed Nagy. They promised him free passage out of the country. They broke their promise, just as the Americans would have done. They lied to him that he would get about the free passage. They seized him, abducted him, took him to Romania, put him on trial, and executed him. And it's brutal and it's nasty, but it got the job done. Within 3 years, the Soviet leaders, Khrushchev, he was in Hollywood, hanging out with Frank Sinatra and Shirley MacLaine. Everything was forgotten. Everyone had forgotten what they'd done. So when it goes back to Russia wants to be liked, wants to be popular in the world, wants to have all sorts of friends, China here, India there, BRICS, South Africa, and the global South, and so on. But that's all very nice. But ultimately, all of these powers will only respect strength and success. That's all they care about. They don't care whether what Russia, who's right and who's wrong about Ukraine. What they want to see is success. That you can actually get this job done. Otherwise, they're just going to go with the winner.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you about China. I wish China would do more heavy lifting because Russia is taking basically the brunt of this current aggression. But we are where we are, and I understand also why Russia would choose that partnership rather than nothing. But to answer the Ukraine question, I think the traditional argument is that in the 90s, Russia was facing its own abyss and it was just too busy to even worry about the other republics. This is why it was so lukewarm or just inactive when it comes to Serbia, right? The traditional, brother nation. And then in the late 90s to the end of the early the 2000s, I say, right? So for more than a decade, it was embroiled in the two Chechen wars from 95 to 2009. And so in this regard, I think it's more understandable why Russia wasn't really thinking of these NGOs and things that have been operating in Ukraine since the 90s. But yes, of course, ultimately, there's a level of being a little too naive regarding the purpose of those NGOs. And, obviously the Orange Revolution should have been a very strong sign in 2004 as to where things could go. And I don't think that sign was necessarily heard where it should have been heard. So I think there's more than one issue of oversight and acting too slowly. There's also the great internal problems that Russia was facing and in many ways successfully overcame, but it came at the price of perhaps losing influence in its not only former republics, but in some cases its former historical lands, which, shouldn't have separated, in my opinion, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Okay, no, but what you're saying is very interesting. But then let's go back to, Viktor Yanukovych. He wins the election in 2010. So he wins this election. He was robbed in 2004. So that was taken away from him. He'd won that election. So that was 2010. Yanukovych runs on a platform of neutrality. Ukraine will be neutral. Ukraine will pursue an independent foreign policy, and it will not move towards NATO. It will not seek to enter NATO. And it was then he changed the law. Yanukovych changed the law after 2010. That was the moment. You now got somebody in there that you need to support. And then, what happened in 2013, 2014? Russia did not throw its weight behind Yanukovych. And I think that is really baffling. And then even after the overthrow of Yanukovych, then and the start of the war in 2014, that was also a moment when Russia could have just knocked over Kiev. I mean, Ukraine was just completely, they weren't ready for a war at all. And, there was absolute opportunity to take over Kiev, or even if you don't take over Kiev, absolutely to take the Donbass. They had their referendum in Donetsk, Lugansk. They wanted to join the Russian Federation. It could have been done there. And at these moments, it's just baffling to understand what Russia was doing. So why they didn't support Yanukovych, why as the 2013, 2014 winter came around and it was clear what was going on. It was absolutely, the West wasn't making any secret that they were trying to overthrow Yanukovych. And the reason they wanted to overthrow Yanukovych, they saw him as pro-Russian, and that this was all about trying to destroy Russia. Why at that moment, Putin did not simply tell Yanukovych, either you use force to put down Maidan or we will. And instead, Putin was issuing statements with Angela Merkel. Oh, we don't want any use of force by either side in Kiev. Now, to me, that's just simply, it makes no sense. It's like, here Russia was in the strong position, was in an absolute driving position, and then you come along and issue these statements with Angela Merkel, in which you're basically telling Yanukovych, don't use force to put down Maidan, when you know that everything that's being done in Maidan is being done by the West. That really is it's kind of very, very, very big a miss by Russia.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the traditional. I'll let you speak in a second,
Yeah, go
Marcelo.
ahead.
Sorry. The traditional explanation for that is that Russia was not ready to face the economic aftermath of sanctions, and it took it a few years to actually free fare. I don't know how true that is. You're absolutely right that militarily, Ukraine did not have this NATO-trained army that it's developed during the course of the so-called Minsk peace agreements that were supposed to bring peace, but were essentially used to train this Ukrainian army and bring it up to NATO standard. In that sense, you're absolutely right. But I'm not sure whether economically Russia would have been able to face the type of sanctions that would have come at the time. And I think in the way I look at Putin, he is very balanced, for better or for worse. He doesn't act fast. And sometimes you're saying the brutality of the Bolsheviks would be more useful in many of these examples than the way he operates. But it seemed like he really, even now, being very loss averse with the way the Ukraine war has been going, he really, I don't think, wanted to change the status quo for the general way of life for the Russian population. Now, of course, there is that interest in being in power. I mean, you could make that argument that he wanted to be popular and stay in power. But again, I think the economic question is an important one. And I think it's difficult to really arrive at this singular decision saying, yes, Russia should have gone in because it was militarily able to do so. I'm not sure if the aftermath, though, was something that Russia or Russia that Putin wants would have been able to face. So that's how I view it.
You can say something about it.
Yeah, just quickly, I think there are many aspects that people still don't understand also about this, which is, for example, the technology of social media. As you mentioned, the NGOs, that was something that they could have seen it through. I remember talking to a friend of mine, trying to explain to him the situation on the Ukrainian Russia situation, and the one thing that he said is like, yeah, the United States did it, like propagandizing and all that. The United States did it. Why Russia did not do it better? And yeah, that's a fair question. Why didn't Russia use its influence on its backyard and influence the people by the propaganda? They should be able to do some of it. People underestimate a lot of Hollywood and United States capabilities especially during these times that we see they doing dumb stuff one after another. But people underestimate the capabilities, and many points that you two rose there that I think are more important, that are very important, are the draconian sanctions. Perhaps Russia at that time, they took a punch but survived and say, okay, perhaps this is what we can get. More than that would be hard. Now we have the part that I'm not exactly agree about China. China is driving the economic war. Yeah, perhaps they're not losing their men and their blood, and they're dropping their blood. But China is driving the economic. Everything that Russia stopped selling to this side now is being sold to China, and vice versa. Of course, China is also providing a lot. So there is some force being doing there. What I'm concerned about my country is that it seems that my country is not doing the force it should be doing in South America. I mean, Brazil, of course. That's my biggest concern. But the social media, especially the social media aspect, is a technology that it is still not 100% understood by anyone. Even the United States don't know the capabilities and incapabilities of their social media that can go against themselves now, which are we are seeing, like the existence of these two channels. And this all these things are very, very important. And of course, just like people mentioned in the chat, and you two also said, Russia was, recent collapsed. The Soviet Union had recently collapsed. We're talking about 20 years apart, 20, 30 years apart from the total collapse to this, with two Chechen wars in the middle, Yugoslavia, and a lot of messing around all over the world. It was not easy times. Even Putin said recently with Nabulina, he kind of said, when the SMO started, we had no idea if everything would go accordingly. It could go all bad, just like that.
Right. Well, then I would have to think in terms of, I don't know what was going on in the minds of Russian leaders in February the 24th, 2022. I assume, again, that's my own opinion. I assume that they were thinking of an operation similar to Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, a quick invasion to shock and startle Ukraine, startle the West, and then to affect regime change. Either you go in to Zelensky's office, and in the line from The Godfather, something like either your brains or your signature are going to be on that document in the next 5 seconds. So make up your mind.
I prefer Pablo Escobar,
Yeah, that's it. So that's it. Then and that it's brutal. And again, that's kind of the way the Bolsheviks used to do it. But it would have done the job. Again, it would have been over very quickly. Now, I think that had to be because when they launched the SMO, they moved towards Kiev. Now they say, well, why did they move towards Kiev? I think they did it in order to shock Zelensky and his cohorts who weren't expecting this. And that's the moment of greatest vulnerability. When they said, well, this is Russia that we're facing. The West would not have done anything. And that didn't happen. What then happened, of course, Russia withdrew its forces from around Kiev, but by doing so, Russia lost its leverage, and I think then I think the war became much more difficult. And again, as I thought, look, Putin, I think, spells it out. The problem is the West. It's the West that's the problem. The West, NATO, they're waging an aggressive war against us. They are the enemy. That's who we're fighting. But unfortunately, who's getting killed? It's Russians and Ukrainians are getting killed. It's not. I mean, if you were killing Germans, great. You're killing Americans, great. Frenchmen, great. I'm happy. If you bomb London, I'm happy. But the problem is that it's Russians and Ukrainians who are dying, and that's not a good situation. And so that's why I think there've been opportunities. I think 2014 were an opportunity. 2022 I think was an opportunity, but Russia always makes it difficult for itself. And I think all along there's always this desire, and it's a long part of the history of Russia, as you know, that they still kind of have a hankering to be a part of the West, and they still have a feeling, well, we want good relations with the West. We're still part of the West. And I think without question, a certain inferiority complex towards the West. So when we talk about Yugoslavia, we were talking about the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Yes, it was set up in 1993, but it continued functioning all the way up to 2018. And the only way it could go on functioning is if the UN Security Council continued to authorize it and provide it with funds. Well, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Why did Russia continue to authorize payment for something that they knew was being driven against the Serbs and was punishing the Serbs, their great ally, the one essentially ally in Europe, and yet they continued to play along with this. that's what, and I think, why did they do it? Well, because they still wanted to be a part of the club, the UN club, the Western club. We're still a part of that, and I think that has unfortunately, they're just not. It's not served Russia well.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a question then of the internal factions within Russia. There's certainly a percentage of these elites that still exist that are pro-Western and would love to have back their lifestyle of having their children living in various Western European capitals, going to schools there and owning property there, which, they no longer can do. There's certainly that issue, which then is, it's not just like Russia is this completely unified country that doesn't have internal debate. I think there's that faction that is still powerful, for better or for worse, and it does have some impact on Russian foreign policy. And you can argue that in many ways it exhibited really naive behavior toward the West, where the official West was very overtly hostile and engaging in actions that would lead to very negative consequences down the line, if not in that particular moment. But Marcelo, we've been going for over an hour, and I saw that the chat is overflowing, but I'm not seeing questions. I'm seeing a lot of comments. Did you catch any questions that George could answer before we depart?
There was some high anxiety, let's call it like that, in the chat for some time. There was one question from Who Cares that was, I think it was about the time of, if I'm not mistaken, about the time of the Orange Revolution that we were talking about. And he said, wasn't Putin fighting the Chechen wars at the time?
Yeah, we answered it. I mean, officially the Chechen wars were over in 2000. The second Chechen war was done by 2009. So yes, Russia was definitely engaged in that particular war, and obviously those wars that involved terrorism, urban warfare, militants from numerous countries that had nothing to do with Chechnya. It's sort of a separate question that we keep touching upon whenever we bring up that period of the 90s and the first decade of Putin's rule.
But that's also an interesting question, because they succeeded in the Chechen wars in many ways. The way the Bolsheviks did. They obviously used a lot of force, but they also bought off the leaders. I mean, they bought off and created a cadre of people who had been against them, like Kadyrov. They were anti-Russian. They'd fought against the Russians, but now they're loyal Russians. They want, and this is the way you do things. You kind of buy people off, killed some people off, and now you've got a cadre that's very loyal to you. And I think that I think is the model that you have to go with. It's not very nice, but ultimately, if Russia is going to survive, then it has to apply there, because the West isn't going to stop. NATO expansion is not going to stop. The West is not going to stop coveting Russian land. It is going to continue to fuel separatist wars on Russia's periphery, inside Russia. It's going to fuel, a political change, the overthrow of the Russian government, any kind of a Russian nationalist government. Is going to keep doing this. So, if Russia wants to survive, then it really has to, pick up its game, because otherwise, that the West just isn't going to stop. And therefore, this is a matter that you have to then act ruthlessly, and stop trying to be loved. Ultimately, you're only going to be loved or respected if you prevail. If you're not able to prevail, then then these great countries, that you cultivate, South Africa or Brazil or whatever, they're going to go their own way.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Power. It's very Machiavellian. Power is sort of at the foundation of all this. And yes, it's going to be the victor that will be remembered and perhaps even revered. But it seems like Russia has been, I mean, it started off with a very limited quote unquote operation in Ukraine, and it's been sort of pushed into a situation of escalation where it has been taken off its gloves. Do you think using that Chechen model of reintegration is possible for some of the Ukraine's regions?
Yeah, I think it will be. I think that will be done. I think that part of the war, I think, will be successful. I think Russia will prevail, certainly in the Donbass. I think and also, I mean, Kherson and Zaporozhye, and I think that will be incorporated within the Russian Federation. The problem will be obviously the high cost. We just don't know the sheer numbers of killed and wounded as a result. The second problem is what happens to the rest of Ukraine, because I think that it will be brought into NATO. And so again, Russia will have the problem that it has, which is on its western borders, with the exception of Belarus, it is surrounded by NATO. Um, and so that obviously is a problem. And I think the ongoing NATO expansion, and I think it's going to move into try to move into the Caucasus, going to try and move into Central Asia. We don't know with success, but I think that's going to continue. But if you've got essentially a kind of rump Ukraine, um, there inside NATO, then you've got a really hostile military alliance right on your western borders, and one that is going to almost certainly initiate some new hostilities within a few years. There's going to,
Don't you think that NATO is sort of past its prime, and as the economic center of the world is moving more towards Asia, that yes, it's not going to just give up and leave as the Warsaw Pact voluntarily dissolved, but at the same time, it's a little bit maybe more of a paper tiger than it's presented as by the official Western propaganda?
No, I actually think it's quite formidable. I mean, what it's accomplished now, and I know people say, "Oh, NATO's losing, NATO's losing." I think NATO will say we've done a good job here. We haven't lost any of our personnel. No NATO lives have been lost. We've kept this war going. We succeeded in getting a lot of Russians killed. We've got Russia and Ukraine, these two Slavic nations, butchering each other. We've inflicted great pain on the Russian people. We've inflicted great pain on the Russian economy, and all relatively inexpensively. So NATO say, yeah, I think we've done a good job here. I think it's a success, and that Russia's putative allies have really not come through, whereas NATO is absolutely, as a solid bloc, supports everything that the head man says. Russia's putative allies, there's, where's the what's the thing called, the sort of the equivalent of NATO, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Where's that? That hasn't appeared. Armenia is not even taking part in it. Kazakhstan's doing nothing, even though Russia had saved Kazakhstan in 2021. And again, China's not doing anything very much. So they'll say, well, Russia's putative, where's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Where are all these, Russia's great allies? They haven't done anything. Even Serbia, little Serbia, hasn't really done very much. It's still voted against Russia at the United Nations. I mean, the Americans keep everyone in line. Everyone, boom, boom. They can rely on on their clients to vote in accordance. But Serbia votes against Russia at the UN. Serbia allows its military equipment to be sent to Ukraine. Now, it's not being done directly, but it's being done indirectly, and we know Serbia, knows about this. I mean, Vucic, the Serbian president, has said, "Yeah, I know about this, but I can't control it." Of course, he can control it. He doesn't want to. So NATO looks upon this and say, "Yeah, we're doing a pretty good job."
So my final question would be, is it possible for Europe and individual European countries to rid itself of the brain slug that is NATO and that's being, as you said, controlled from a different continent, by and large, financially and decision-making wise?
Well, I think it could. Is it going to? I don't think so. I mean, even the European leaders were the most critical of the NATO and EU policy toward Russia and Ukraine. Somebody like Viktor Orban. Orban would never dream of withdrawing from NATO. In fact, I think if he tried to do it, I think he would probably be overthrown in Hungary. I don't see at the moment. I mean, things could change. I don't see any movement within the West to get out of NATO. The only possibility, and I think even there, I think it's unlikely, is if we got to a serious confrontation. I mean, and that means a real shooting war between NATO and Russia, and then people might start thinking seriously about where this is going. But at the moment, I don't see any serious movement against NATO. I mean, I know, with political parties, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and now we've got the Freedom Party in Austria. But these are still minor parties, and they're not even likely to be able to get into government anytime in the future. They're going to be kept out of power, by the establishment. Marine Le Pen, I think she's been all over the place when it comes to NATO. So, yes, this slug, this brain dead, horrific parasite monster NATO that's been an absolute drag on Europe. I wish we could see the back of it. I just don't see it for the time being.
Yeah, no, just want to add one thing that I said the other day. I don't like to quote myself, but this time I think it works. That we were talking with Sasha Kramer the other day, and I mentioned that we are always used to look at the situation as the West tripping on his own stupidity. And sometimes we forget to look that perhaps it wasn't luck that the things developed this way. And perhaps there was thoughts developed during years and years and years to come to arrive to the situation that we are today. And one of the most important, and it was basically what Putin put on the table on that meeting on November, December of 2021, was the new European security architecture. And I myself, and this is crystal ball, I myself think that the situation is not going to be over until this is done.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But the problem was that, and Putin found this in December 2021, that Russia does not command the respect that the Soviet Union did. I mean, had the Soviet Union come up with something like this, I mean, it would have been taken seriously. But in December 2021, the West refused to take Russia seriously. It said, "Hey, you aren't the Soviet Union, and while we were afraid of the Soviet Union, and that's why we treated it with respect, we aren't afraid of you, and we don't treat you with respect." And I think Putin has really, from the beginning, he's wanted to enjoy the respect that the Soviet Union enjoyed, but he's not going to get it. And I think that's absolutely the issue, that there's not going to be any kind of a security architecture, kind of Helsinki 2.0, until the West learns to respect Russia. But at the moment, I don't see that happening. They just don't think Russia is an equal. And this is said by Boris Johnson. I mean, Boris Johnson has openly said, "We just don't respect Russia. We just don't think Russia is our equal."
Until they got a bomb in the middle of London. That's a choosing.
Good job.
It's a nice joke, Marcelo. Marcelo, let's stay hypothetical here. We want to maintain our social media channels, a very, very dark humor. And look, this is an indication that the show is about to end. She's had enough. She's had enough of me talking, so she decided to come join us. George,
what kind of a dog is that?
Well, I have two. I have a purebred Basset Hound, and this one is from the shelter, but she's got one blue eye, which is why she's
that's
beautiful.
nice.
Yeah, so she's Yeah, we're not sure. It might be a husky or a shepherd mix with a beagle or something like that. But she's sort of like patiently waiting till I'm done, and then she's like, I've had enough. And so usually this is when we end the episode. She comes to get some love and to get some love from her fans on the channels here. So George, other than the book that you're not sure when it's coming out, but it definitely sounds like a very interesting read, is there anything else that we should know about what you're working on now? And are there any websites other than your X/Twitter, the Gaggle, where people can follow you that we can link
Yeah, I
to?
mean, you can also follow me on my Substack.
I did link that.
Exactly, the Substack. And please, I mean, the Gaggle, it's on locals, so please subscribe. You don't have to pay. I mean, ideally, you can pay a subscription fee, but you can just sign and enjoy the content. There's a lot of free content. There's some content that you have to pay for. But please, if your audience can go, the Gaggle, one word, the Gaggle.local.
It's linked. It's linked. How are you finding that platform? Are you liking it?
Well, it's okay, but we don't get enough enough traffic, and I think that's the problem.
Because it's not YouTube basically, and YouTube obviously
exactly. I think that's a problem. Yeah. So it's good. I mean, there's free speech, and it's true, no one censors you, but it also doesn't have there's just not enough traffic really. We've got to up the ante. Got to get a lot more.
So everyone, go to the link in the description box. Go to the Gaggle and support George's work. We would love to have him back on this channel. Maybe a little bit more optimistic than our final words here. No, he's a realist. He's a Machiavellian realist. In geopolitics. Well, thank you so much for watching. Thank you, George, for coming. Thank you, Marcelo, for doing all the tech stuff. Guys, we might be off for a couple weeks while Marcelo is away, but we'll see you very soon. And thank you for watching. See you soon.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you, George. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.